Tomorrow could be one of the most decisive days in Zambia's recent history. On August 4th, the South African High Court will finally rule on the fate of former President Edgar Lungu's body. Will it return to Zambia for burial or remain in South Africa under court orders? Behind the legal battle lies politics, family disputes, and deep national emotions. In this video, we break down what's at stake, the possible outcomes, and why tomorrow's verdict could change everything. The fate of former President Edgar Chagwa Lungu's body will be decided on August 4th by the South African High Court. This ruling could end weeks of legal and diplomatic tensions between Zambia, South Africa, and the Lungu family. In this report by InspirAfrica official, we cover Red Circle, the background of the burial dispute, why South African courts got involved, the positions of the Lungu family and the Zambian government, possible scenarios after tomorrow's verdict. Watch until the end to understand what could happen next and why this case has captured the attention of the entire nation. Subscribe to InspirAfrica official for real-time African political news and exclusive investigations. Tomorrow's decision day. On August 4th, 2025, a significant legal and political event is set to unfold in Pretoria, South Africa, as the Gauteng High Court hears a case that has captured the attention of Zambia, South Africa, and the broader African continent. The dispute centers on the final resting place of Zambia's former President Edgar Lungu, who passed away on June 5th, 2025, at the age of 68 in a South African hospital. The Pretoria High Court's ruling on this date will determine whether Lungu's body is repatriated to Zambia for a state funeral or buried in South Africa as per his family's wishes. This case is not merely a legal battle over burial rights, but a reflection of deep-seated political rivalries, questions of national sovereignty, and the complex interplay of personal wishes versus state protocols in post-colonial African governance. The significance of August 4th, 2025 lies in its potential to resolve a month-long standoff that has stirred emotions, sparked political tensions, and raised questions about Zambia's institutional frameworks and its relationship with South Africa. The dispute has roots in the bitter political feud between Lungu and his successor, President Hakainde Hichilema, which has persisted beyond Lungu's death, highlighting the challenges of reconciling personal grievances with national interests. The outcome of this hearing will likely set a precedent for how African states handle the deaths of former leaders, particularly when disputes arise between families and governments, and when those disputes cross international borders. This case also underscores broader themes in African politics, including the tension between state authority and individual rights, the legacy of political rivalries, and the role of foreign courts in resolving disputes involving African leaders. The decision day is poised to be a defining moment, not only for the Lungu family and the Zambian government, but also for Zambia's national identity and its diplomatic relations with South Africa. As the continent watches, the ruling could influence how future disputes over the burials of prominent figures are managed, potentially reshaping protocols and expectations across Africa. The burial dispute, how it started. The dispute over Edgar Lungu's burial began shortly after his death on June 5th, 2025, in a South African hospital where he was receiving treatment for an undisclosed illness. Lungu, who served as Zambia's president from 2015 to 2021, was a polarizing figure in Zambian politics, known for his leadership of the Patriotic Front (PF) and his contentious relationship with his successor, Hakainde Hichilema. The origins of the burial dispute are rooted in this political rivalry, compounded by differing interpretations of Zambian law, cultural expectations, and Lungu's personal wishes as conveyed by his family. Initial plans and breakdown. Following Lungu's death, the Zambian government announced plans for a state funeral, a customary honor for former presidents, to be held at Embassy Park Presidential Burial Site in Lusaka, where other Zambian leaders are interred. The government declared a 7-day national mourning period and prepared a grave for Lungu, emphasizing that as a former head of state, he belongs to the nation of Zambia and should be buried with full military honors in accordance with national protocols. However, Lungu's family, supported by the Patriotic Front, rejected the government's plans, citing Lungu's explicit instructions that Hichilema should not be involved in his funeral arrangements. The family's distrust stemmed from a history of animosity, including Hichilema's imprisonment for over 100 days on treason charges in 2017 during Lungu's presidency, following an incident where Hichilema's motorcade allegedly failed to yield to Lungu's. This incident, among others, fueled a deep-seated rivalry that continued after Hichilema defeated Lungu in the 2021 presidential election. Initially, there appeared to be a tentative agreement between the Lungu family and the government for a state funeral in Zambia, with negotiations facilitated by Zambia's Foreign Minister Malambo Haimbi and South Africa's Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola. However, relations broke down when the family accused the government of reneging on the agreement by planning a funeral program that included significant involvement by Hichilema, contrary to Lungu's wishes. Frustrated, the family opted for a private burial in South Africa, specifically in Johannesburg, where a memorial service was held at the Cathedral of Christ the King on June 25, 2025. Escalation and legal intervention. The Zambian government, unwilling to cede control over Lungu's burial, filed an urgent application in the Pretoria High Court on June 24, 2025, seeking an injunction to halt the family's planned private burial in South Africa. The court, presided over by Deputy Judge President Aubrey Fago Ledwaba, issued an order on June 25, 2025, preventing the burial from proceeding, as both parties agreed to delay until the matter could be fully adjudicated. This last-minute intervention caused chaos for mourners who had gathered in Johannesburg, expecting a funeral service, only to learn after a mass that the burial was postponed. The legal battle escalated as the court set deadlines for submissions. The Zambian government was given until July 4, 2025, to file an amended notice of motion supporting repatriation, while the Lungu family had until July 11, 2025, to submit opposing papers. The case was scheduled for a full hearing on August 4, 2025, effectively suspending Lungu's burial for over a month. This delay has prolonged the emotional and political strain on all parties, turning a solemn occasion into a public and international spectacle. Contextual factors. The dispute is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of conflicts over the burials of African leaders. Historical precedents, such as the burial of Zambia's first president, Kenneth Kaunda, in 2021, where the government overruled the family's wishes to bury him at Embassy Memorial Park, have informed the current standoff. Similar disputes have occurred in Angola with José Eduardo dos Santos, and in Ghana with various presidents, where state interests often prevail over family preferences. In Lungu's case, the international dimension, his death in South Africa, and the involvement of a South African court adds complexity, raising questions about sovereignty and interstate relations. The feud between Lungu and Hichilema has also been exacerbated by actions taken during Hichilema's presidency, including the withdrawal of Lungu's retirement benefits after he re-entered politics and the Constitutional Court's ruling in 2024 that barred Lungu from running in the 2026 election due to term limits. These actions deepened the Lungu family's distrust, leading them to believe that a state funeral in Zambia would lack dignity and be used for political posturing by Hichilema's administration. Lungu family's position. The Lungu family's stance is driven by a combination of personal wishes, distrust of the Zambian government, and a desire to honor the former president's legacy on their terms. Their position can be summarized as follows. Respecting Lungu's wishes. The family, through their spokesperson Makibi Zulu, has repeatedly emphasized that Edgar Lungu left explicit instructions that President Hakainde Hichilema should not be involved in his funeral arrangements or be present at his burial. This request stems from the long-standing personal and political enmity between the two leaders, which included Hichilema's imprisonment under Lungu's regime and perceived harassment of Lungu after his presidency, such as restrictions on his movements and travel bans. The family believes that allowing Hichilema to preside over a state funeral would betray Lungu's conscience and dishonor his memory. Makibi Zulu articulated this sentiment, stating that the family wants to tell a great story of President Edgar Chagwa Lungu, how he lived as a president, served the nation as a president, and thereafter was betrayed by the system, cast aside by the system. This narrative frames Lungu as a victim of political persecution, reinforcing the family's determination to control the funeral arrangements to reflect his legacy as they see it. Preference for a private burial in South Africa. Rejecting the state funeral in Zambia, the family planned a private burial in Johannesburg, South Africa, where Lungu died. They organized a memorial service at the Cathedral of Christ the King on June 25, 2025, attended by Lungu's widow, Esther Lungu, their children, and members of the Patriotic Front. The choice of South Africa was influenced by practical and symbolic factors. Lungu's death occurred there, and the family felt that South African authorities were more likely to respect their autonomy, as evidenced by their initial non-interference stance. The family's decision was also a response to their exclusion from planning the state funeral in Zambia. They accused the government of sidelining them and imposing a program that disregarded Lungu's wishes. Additionally, reports surfaced that two of Lungu's children were denied permission to leave Zambia to attend the memorial in South Africa, which the family interpreted as deliberate cruelty by Hichilema's administration. These incidents further entrenched their resolve to keep the burial out of Zambia's control. Legal and moral arguments. In their legal submissions, due by July 11, 2025, the family is expected to argue that South African law prioritizes the rights of the deceased's family to determine funeral arrangements. They may cite Lungu's explicit instructions as a moral and legal basis for their claim, emphasizing that forcing a state funeral in Zambia would violate his final wishes and the family's autonomy. The family's lawyer, Makibi Zulu, has expressed concerns that a state funeral under Hichilema's oversight would lack dignity and be shrouded in mockery and political public relations. The family also draws on cultural arguments, asserting that as Africans, they have a right to honor their loved one in a manner that respects his personal desires. They view the government's legal action in a foreign court as an overreach and an attempt to wrest control of Lungu's remains, further straining relations. The family's position is not only about burial location, but also about asserting their agency against a government they perceive as hostile. Challenges and vulnerabilities. The family's stance, while emotionally compelling, faces significant legal and political hurdles. South African courts may consider the Zambian government's arguments about national interest and precedent, particularly given the involvement of a foreign head of state. Additionally, the family's decision to keep Lungu's body in South Africa has fueled public speculation and conspiracy theories, with some questioning the transparency of his death. This has placed the family under scrutiny as they navigate both legal proceedings and public opinion. Zambia government's position. The Zambian government, led by President Hakainde Hichilema, has taken a firm stance that Edgar Lungu, as a former president is a national property whose burial should be handled by the state in accordance with Zambian law and tradition. Their position is grounded in legal, institutional, and nationalistic arguments. Legal and institutional arguments. The government cites the 2008 Burial Site Act, Cap 264, of Zambia, which designates Embassy Park as the official burial site for former presidents, though it does not mandate it. They argue that Lungu's status as a former head of state supersedes personal or family preferences, as his burial is a matter of public interest. This position is supported by a precedent set in 2021, when the Zambian High Court ruled that the burial of founding President Kenneth Kaunda at Embassy Memorial Park took precedence over his family's wishes to bury him elsewhere. Zambia's Attorney General, Mulalo Kabesha, has emphasized that state funerals with full military honors are required by law to ensure a dignified and appropriate send-off for former presidents, allowing all Zambians to pay their respects. The government has already prepared a grave for Lungu at Embassy Park, underscoring their commitment to this protocol. Kabesha's legal filings in the Pretoria High Court assert that personal wishes must yield to national interest, framing Lungu's repatriation as a matter of state sovereignty and institutional continuity. Political and symbolic considerations. The government views Lungu's burial as an opportunity to reinforce Zambia's national identity and institutional frameworks. By insisting on a state funeral, Hichilema's administration seeks to project unity and respect for tradition, particularly in a Christian-majority country where mourning periods are taken seriously. The government argues that allowing Lungu to be buried abroad could set a dangerous precedent, potentially encouraging other families of former leaders to bypass national protocols, thus undermining state authority. Hichilema has framed his position as one of national duty, stating that Lungu belongs to the nation of Zambia and should be buried with full honors at home. This rhetoric aligns with broader efforts to strengthen Zambia's institutional resilience, particularly in a post-colonial context where state sovereignty is paramount. However, critics argue that the government's insistence may also be motivated by a desire to control the narrative around Lungu's legacy, given the political rivalry between Hichilema and Lungu. Diplomatic efforts and challenges. The Zambian government has engaged in diplomatic efforts to resolve the dispute, including sending envoys to South Africa and involving South African Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola in negotiations. However, these efforts have been hampered by mutual distrust, with the family accusing the government of bad faith. The government's decision to pursue legal action in a South African court has been controversial, with some arguing it risks Zambia's dignity by airing domestic disputes abroad. The government also faces challenges in public perception. The abrupt end to the national mourning period on June 20, 2025, after the family opted for a South African burial, was seen by some as a sign of frustration or pettiness, potentially eroding public support. Moreover, allegations of restricting Lungu's children from traveling to South Africa have fueled accusations of vindictiveness, complicating the government's narrative of acting in the national interest. South African court involvement. The involvement of the South African judicial system, specifically the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria, has added an international dimension to the dispute, raising questions about jurisdiction, sovereignty, and the role of foreign courts in African political matters. Court's initial ruling. On June 25, 2025, the Pretoria High Court, under Deputy Judge President Aubrey Fago Ledwaba, issued an urgent order halting Lungu's burial in Johannesburg, following a last-minute application by Zambia's Attorney General Mulalo Kabesha. The court's decision was based on an agreement between the Lungu family and the Zambian government to postpone the burial until the case could be fully heard. Ledwaba acknowledged the grief and pain caused by the delay, emphasizing the cultural importance of laying the deceased to rest respectfully. The court set a timeline for legal submissions. The Zambian government was to file an amended notice of motion by July 4, 2025. The Lungu family was to respond by July 11, 2025, and any third parties wishing to intervene, e.g. as amicus curiae, had until July 18, 2025. The case was scheduled for a full hearing on August 4, 2025 as a special motion, with costs to be determined at that time. The court also granted the Lungu family permission to visit the former president's remains at a Johannesburg mortuary, addressing humanitarian concerns during the delay. Legal and jurisdictional considerations. The court's involvement raises complex legal questions. South African law generally prioritizes the rights of the deceased's family to determine funeral arrangements, which could favor the Lungu family's position. However, the Zambian government's argument hinges on international precedent and the notion that a former head of state is a national figure whose burial implicates state sovereignty. The court must balance these competing claims, considering both South African legal principles and the diplomatic implications of ruling against a foreign government. South Africa's position is delicate, as hosting the burial of a foreign president without Zambia's consent could strain bilateral relations and set a precedent for future interstate disputes. President Cyril Ramaphosa and Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola have expressed a preference for respecting the family's wishes while acknowledging the appropriateness of a state funeral in Zambia, reflecting South Africa's attempt to navigate navigate this diplomatically. Implications of the court's role. The court's involvement has already caused significant disruption, as seen in the chaos at the Cathedral of Christ the King, where mourners were informed of the burial's postponement only after a mass. The delay has prolonged the emotional toll on the Lungu family and their supporters, while also drawing international attention to the dispute. The August 4th hearing will likely scrutinize the legal merits of both sides, including the applicability of Zambian law in a South African context and the weight of Lungu's personal wishes versus national interests. The court's decision could also influence South Africa's role as a neutral arbiter in African disputes. By adjudicating this case, South Africa risks being perceived as taking sides in Zambia's internal political conflicts, which could complicate its position in regional organizations like the Southern African Development Community (SADC). Possible verdict outcomes. The Pretoria High Court's ruling on August 4, 2025 could result in several possible outcomes, each with significant implications for the Lungu family, the Zambian government, and Zambia-South Africa relations. Below are the primary scenarios. 1. Ruling in favor of the Zambian government. The court could rule that Lungu's body must be repatriated to Zambia for a state funeral at Embassy Park, upholding the government's argument that national interest and legal precedent take precedence. This outcome would likely cite the 2008 Burial Site Act and the Konda case, reinforcing the state's authority over former presidents' burials. Implications for Zambia. This would strengthen the government's narrative of institutional continuity and sovereignty, potentially boosting Hichilema's domestic standing among supporters who value national protocols. However, it could deepen divisions with Lungu supporters and the Patriotic Front, who may view it as a political victory for Hichilema. For the Lungu family, the family would likely feel betrayed, as their wishes and Lungu's instructions would be overridden. This could lead to further legal challenges or public protests, though their options would be limited in South Africa. For South Africa, this ruling would align with diplomatic efforts to maintain good relations with Zambia, avoiding a precedent where foreign leaders are buried in South Africa against their home government's wishes. Political fallout. The Patriotic Front could use this outcome to rally supporters, framing it as evidence of Hichilema's vindictiveness, potentially escalating political tensions ahead of Zambia's 2026 elections. 2. Ruling in favor of the Lungu family. The court could uphold the family's right to bury Lungu in South Africa, prioritizing South African legal principles that favor family autonomy and Lungu's explicit wishes. This would allow the private burial to proceed in Johannesburg, likely at a site chosen by the family. Implications for Zambia. This would be a significant blow to the government's authority, potentially undermining the precedent of state-controlled burials for former presidents. It could embolden other families to challenge similar protocols, weakening institutional norms. For the Lungu family, this would be a victory, allowing them to honor Lungu's wishes and avoid what they perceive as a politicized state funeral. However, it could alienate some Zambians who view a South African burial as a rejection of national pride. For South Africa, this ruling could strain relations with Zambia, as it would imply South Africa's willingness to override a foreign government's claims. It might also set a precedent for other African families to seek burials in South Africa, complicating interstate relations. Political fallout. Hichilema's administration could face criticism for failing to secure Lungu's repatriation, potentially damaging its image domestically and regionally. The Patriotic Front could gain political capital by portraying the family's victory as a rebuke of Hichilema's leadership. 3. Compromise or mediated solution. The court could encourage or mandate a mediated solution, such as allowing the family to hold a private memorial in South Africa while requiring repatriation for a state burial in Zambia. Alternatively, the court could defer to ongoing negotiations, delaying the final ruling to give both parties time to reach an agreement. Implications for Zambia. A compromise could de-escalate tensions, allowing the government to uphold some aspects of national protocol while respecting the family's wishes. It would require delicate diplomacy to avoid perceptions of capitulation. For the Lungu family, a mediated solution might partially satisfy their desire for autonomy, though they may resist any involvement by Hichilema. Their willingness to compromise could depend on guarantees of dignity and minimal government interference. For South Africa, this outcome would position South Africa as a neutral facilitator, preserving its diplomatic standing while avoiding a definitive ruling that favors one side. Political fallout. A compromise could reduce political tensions in Zambia, though both sides might face criticism from hardliners. The Patriotic Front and Hichilema's United Party for National Development (UPND) would need to navigate public perceptions carefully to avoid appearing weak. 4. Dismissal or jurisdictional ruling. The court could dismiss the case on jurisdictional grounds, arguing that it lacks authority to adjudicate a dispute involving a foreign head of state's burial, effectively leaving the matter to Zambia and the Lungu family to resolve. This is less likely given the court's prior engagement, but possible if it seeks to avoid a precedent-setting decision. Implications for Zambia. This would shift the dispute back to Zambia, potentially leading to renewed negotiations or a domestic legal battle. The government might pursue further action to secure repatriation, possibly escalating tensions. For the Lungu family, a dismissal could allow the family to proceed with a South African burial, assuming no further legal barriers arise. However, they would remain vulnerable to Zambian government pressure. For South Africa, This would absolve South Africa of responsibility, preserving its neutrality but potentially prolonging the dispute without resolution. Political fallout. A lack of resolution could exacerbate divisions in Zambia, with both sides claiming victory or victimization, further polarizing the political landscape. Public reactions and political fallout. The burial dispute has elicited strong reactions from Zambians, South Africans, and the international community, reflecting the deep divisions within Zambia's political landscape and the broader implications for African governance. Zambian public reactions. In Zambia, the dispute has caused confusion and sadness among citizens, many of whom are grieving Lungu's death but are unsure how to mourn due to the conflicting directives from the government and the Patriotic Front. Radio stations have played gospel music, reflecting Zambia's Christian identity and the solemnity of the moment, but the standoff has disrupted the traditional mourning process. Supporters of the Patriotic Front, Lungu's political base, have rallied behind the family, viewing the government's actions as an extension of Hichilema's alleged persecution of Lungu during his lifetime. Accusations that Hichilema's administration restricted Lungu's movements and barred him from traveling abroad for medical treatment have fueled conspiracy theories, with some even questioning the circumstances of Lungu's death. A Zambian Observer article demanded transparency and accountability, suggesting potential legal consequences for the family if they are found to have misled the public about Lungu's death, though such claims remain speculative and inflammatory. Conversely, supporters of Hichilema and the United Party for National Development (UPND) argue that the government's insistence on a state funeral reflects respect for national tradition and sovereignty. They view the family's refusal to repatriate Lungu's body as disrespectful to Zambia's heritage and an attempt to politicize his death. The government's decision to end the national mourning period abruptly on June 20, 2025 was met with mixed reactions, with some seeing it as a pragmatic move to resume normalcy, while others viewed it as dismissive of Lungu's legacy. South African public reactions. In South Africa, the dispute has garnered attention due to its international implications and the involvement of the Pretoria High Court. South Africans have expressed sympathy for the Lungu family's grief, particularly after the chaotic scenes at the Cathedral of Christ the King, where mourners were left waiting due to the court's last-minute ruling. However, there is also recognition of the diplomatic tightrope South Africa must walk, as hosting Lungu's burial could strain relations with Zambia. Media outlets like News 24 and The South African have highlighted the legal and political complexities, framing the case as a test of South Africa's judicial impartiality and its role in African diplomacy. Political fallout. The political fallout in Zambia is significant, as the dispute has deepened the divide between the UPND and the Patriotic Front, potentially shaping the narrative for the 2026 presidential election. The Patriotic Front has accused Hichilema's government of using the burial dispute to marginalize Lungu's legacy, with some PF leaders suggesting that the government's actions are partly responsible for his death due to alleged restrictions on his medical travel. This narrative could galvanize PF supporters, positioning Lungu as a martyr and Hichilema as a vindictive leader. For Hichilema, the dispute is a double-edged sword. Successfully securing Lungu's repatriation could reinforce his administration's authority and commitment to national protocols, but it risks alienating Lungu's supporters and fueling perceptions of authoritarianism. Conversely, losing the case could weaken his government's credibility, particularly if the family's narrative of betrayal gains traction. The government's decision to pursue legal action in South Africa has already drawn criticism for airing Zambia's internal conflicts abroad, potentially damaging national pride. Regionally, the dispute has drawn attention from African media and political analysts, who see it as emblematic of broader challenges in post-colonial governance, including the tension between state authority and individual rights and the legacy of political rivalries. The involvement of South Africa's courts has sparked discussions about the role of foreign jurisdictions in African disputes, with some arguing that Zambia should resolve the matter domestically to preserve sovereignty. Final thoughts. What happens after August 4th? The outcome of the August 4th, 2025 hearing will have far-reaching implications for Zambia, South Africa, and the broader African continent. Regardless of the court's decision, the resolution of this dispute will shape political narratives, institutional precedents, and diplomatic relations for years to come. Short-term consequences. In the immediate aftermath, the court's ruling will determine whether Lungu's body is buried in South Africa or repatriated to Zambia. A decision in favor of the government could lead to a state funeral in Lusaka, potentially accompanied by public ceremonies, but also protests from PF supporters. A ruling for the family would allow a private burial in Johannesburg, possibly easing tensions with the family, but sparking criticism from Zambians who view it as a rejection of national heritage. The emotional toll on the Lungu family will be significant, as the prolonged delay has already exacerbated their grief. The court's granting of visitation rights to the mortuary has provided some relief, but a final resolution is crucial for closure. For Zambian citizens, the ruling will either restore a sense of national unity or deepen divisions, depending on how it is perceived. Long-term implications. The case will set a precedent for how African states handle disputes over the burials of former leaders, particularly when they occur abroad. A government victory could reinforce the principle that former presidents are national figures subject to state protocols, potentially strengthening institutional frameworks across the continent. However, it could also embolden governments to override family wishes, raising concerns concerns about individual rights. A family victory, conversely, could empower families to assert greater control over funeral arrangements, challenging state authority, and potentially leading to more disputes. It could also encourage other African families to seek burials abroad, complicating interstate relations and raising questions about national identity. Diplomatically, the outcome will affect Zambia-South Africa relations. A ruling that aligns with Zambia's position would likely strengthen bilateral ties, while a decision favoring the family could create tensions, particularly if Zambia perceives South Africa as undermining its sovereignty. South Africa's role as a regional leader will be scrutinized, as its handling of this case could influence its credibility in mediating African disputes. Political ramifications in Zambia. The dispute has already reignited Zambia's political fault lines, and the ruling will shape the narrative for the 2026 election. The Patriotic Front could use the outcome to rally supporters, portraying Hichilema as either a tyrant who disrespected Lungu's wishes or a weak leader who failed to secure his repatriation. The UPND, meanwhile, will need to manage public perceptions carefully, balancing respect for tradition with the need to avoid appearing vindictive. The case has also highlighted the need for clearer legal frameworks in Zambia regarding the burials of former presidents. The 2008 Burial Site Act's ambiguity, permitting but not requiring burial at Embassy Park, has contributed to the dispute. Future reforms could address this gap, ensuring that such conflicts are resolved domestically and with greater clarity. Broader African context. The Lungu burial dispute reflects broader challenges in African governance, including the personalization of politics, the legacy of colonial-era institutions, and the tension between state and individual rights. Similar disputes in Angola, Ghana, and Zimbabwe demonstrate that these issues are not unique to Zambia, but the international dimension of this case sets it apart. The involvement of a South African court underscores the complexities of globalization and cross-border deaths, particularly for prominent figures. As African nations continue to build institutional resilience, cases like this highlight the importance of balancing tradition with modernity, sovereignty with individual autonomy, and political reconciliation with historical grievances. The resolution of this dispute could serve as a model or a cautionary tale for how African states navigate such challenges in the future. Path forward. Regardless of the outcome, both the Lungu family and the Zambian government would benefit from pursuing quiet diplomacy post-ruling to de-escalate tensions. Public statements should avoid inflammatory rhetoric, and both sides should prioritize unity and dignity in honoring Lungu's legacy. The government could offer logistical support for a private memorial if the family prevails, while the family could agree to a symbolic state ceremony if repatriation is ordered as a gesture of national reconciliation. Ultimately, the dispute is not just about Edgar Lungu's final resting place, but about Zambia's identity as a nation and its ability to heal from political divisions. The events following August 4, 2025 will test Zambia's commitment to unity, institutional integrity, and respect for both its leaders and its citizens.